Welcome to Aon at the Top, where I have the honor of interviewing some of the most distinguished executives, C-suite and board members about their journeys and their paths to success. I'm your host, Nicole Ward, the Senior Vice President of Sales at Aon. And in this series, we draw out meaningful insights and candid perspectives on navigating to the top. At Aon, we help you make better business decisions by turning risk into resilience. Today, we get to welcome Chief Legal Officer, Corporate Strategist, and Impact-Driven Leader, Arthi Chakravarthy. Arthi Chakravarthy is the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Development at Enovix, where she helps lead the charge in next-gen battery technology. With over 2 decades of experience guiding high-growth semiconductor and manufacturing companies, Arthi brings deep expertise in legal strategy, M&A, and executive leadership. Her career spans influential roles at some of the industry's most innovative companies, including General Counsel at Lightning eMotors, Deputy General Counsel at Micron Technology, and VP of Commercial Legal Affairs at TiVo. She started her journey in law at powerhouse firms Wilson Sonsini and Morrison Foerster before moving in-house to help scale global tech organizations. Beyond the boardroom, Arthi is a committed social impact leader, serving since 2009 as a board member of Hospital for Hope India, a nonprofit providing essential health care in rural India. She's a double Stanford graduate. Arthi earned her JD from Stanford Law School, where she was editor of the Stanford Law Review, and holds a BA in human biology with honors. On this episode of Aon at the Top, Arthi shares how she navigates complex negotiations, builds resilience in high-stakes environments, and leads with purpose at the intersection of law, business, and innovation. Arthi, welcome, and thank you so much for being here. What a background.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm so humbled to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. Well, let's start. Let's make it all about you. I would love to hear from a personal journey perspective, a little bit about how you got where you are. You know, if we rewind the clock just a little bit and you think back at the outset of your career, was it all by design? Did you have a vision that this was someday where you'd end up? Tell us about the beginnings.
That's a good question. I mean, just reflecting back, I think, there were some elements of planning and some elements of being opportunistic. So when I graduated from law school, the traditional pathway was going to a law firm and then becoming a law firm partner. And the perception that I had in my mind was that the best attorneys were partners at law firms. And once I got to once I started practicing, I really stayed mindful of what I wanted to do and what practice areas I wanted to cultivate. And so I think the standard advice for first year associates or second year associates was just to fill your hours, work as hard as possible, take all the projects that you could have. And for me, when I graduated from law school, I loved law school. I loved thinking like an attorney, and I liked kind of really focusing on different types of law. And so I didn't necessarily actually take every project that came my way, especially in the beginning when you're starting as a law firm associate. A lot of the work that you have to do is due diligence. And for me, the due diligence was just mind numbing. I was I couldn't do it. It was just hours of just reading without a clear endpoint. And so for me, one of the things which I think I did, which was a little bit different, was I was very particular about the projects that I chose, the partners I worked with. I wanted to make sure that when I was working with a partner, I got to work on things that were more meaningful and that I thought would help my career. And eventually, when I became client-facing, which some partners are really great about, they give you those opportunities early on as a first year or second year. I realized I really loved working with business teams and trying to figure out ways to enable business teams, and really that I was a deal lawyer. So, when I was at Wilson Sonsini, I worked mostly with CEOs and CFOs. Some of them were small startups, and some of them grew very quickly and became public. And working directly with them really helped shape my understanding of risk. When and how are risks assessed? And so I feel like that was a really kind of foundational opportunity for me now as a GC, because it was, understanding, what was in their mind when they agreed to certain things. So eventually I moved in-house, and I just loved being in-house. I think like when I was at the law firm, it was always like in-house, you wouldn't necessarily get all of the same opportunities, but working in-house, like I found I had a little more work-life balance, and I was even more integrated with the business teams, which was super, super exciting. And when I first joined TiVo, it was a very interesting time at the company. There was lots of challenges going on. I remember when I first joined, immediately I realized there was a lot of internal politics. Which was very different from being at a law firm, from being at my law firm objectives were very simple. It was, bill as much as possible, try to develop client relationships, eventually to bring in more and more business. And when I was at TiVo, it was a very different ballgame. And I just wasn't prepared. I wasn't prepared. I didn't know how to handle a lot of the internal politics. There were different teams within the company, and the different teams had different agendas. I eventually hired a coach to help me navigate the workplace issues, which I think was really invaluable. I ended up joining Micron shortly after, and this was like I thought it would be a very strategic opportunity. In some ways, it was a very different opportunity because it was a Fortune 500 company. It was very stable. Micron is one of the few companies in the world that sells memory. There's a lot of stability to the business that wasn't there at TiVo. TiVo ended up, being acquired. And I think here at Micron, I've just really learned. I learned how to lead a large team, how to help the company drive towards 30 billion in annual sales, and it was just a wonderful kind of experience where one of the most critical things I think I learned at Micron was the importance of people and culture. And I distinctly remember one of the first things that happened, like one of the first things I had to do when I joined Micron was to do a cultural sensitivity training. And that really just ingrained in me, because I was like, oh, I didn't realize like like in the US, like it's a US business forum, you can shake hands, but in other countries, you don't shake hands. And so it was just very eye-opening to me that there were, that sometimes cultures could be opposite in terms of what a business storm could be. And so it was a very eye-opening experience. I ended up being opportunistic, so I worked very closely with the GC at Micron, and I thought it was amazing. And my goal was to join a public company, work in a company that had a mission, like a mission that would help improve society, or that would make the world a better place. And also, be a public company general counsel. And so when I got the opportunity at Lightning eMotors, I was just so thrilled. It was super excited because I was like, it kind of just ticked all of those boxes for me. And I really love the management team there. I thought I thought everybody was just, we were all extremely excited. Finally, more recently, I just joined here at Enovix, and at Enovix, I feel like there was a lot of learnings from Lightning eMotors. I was looking for, a company that had a very strong CEO and a very strong board, that was in a good kind of place, and would also be working on like something that would really transform society.
That's terrific. What I heard there as a theme is sort of your commitment to learning and to vulnerability, right? To go someplace and say, I'm willing to get a coach because there's some political landscape I need to learn to navigate. That's amazing. Then, going to, your next role and seeking guidance from the GC at the time, to give you sort of insight and, and then the willingness, like you were saying, to learn about culture, and taking the cultural sensitivity so seriously. All of that, it just tells me that there's a vulnerability on your part, a willingness to learn, and a commitment to learning and to grow. Where does that come from? If you think about your childhood and kind of growing up, where does that come from?
My family background is probably very different from most people. So my mom was 17 when she got married, and she had an arranged marriage. So she came from India, and my dad was like maybe he was 21 or 22 when they got married, and then they had me immediately afterwards. So my mom migrated to the U.S. My dad had finished his education. He had gotten married, and then immediately they kind of had a baby on their hands. So my mother had not finished college. She had not even started college at the point that she had me. I lived with my parents for 3 years, and then finally, when she was 21, she was like, "Okay, it's time. I need to support, help support my family." And then my father actually had health issues, so he became disabled very shortly after they were married. And so for my mother, it was very critical that she go back to, that she go to school, she get an education. And so I actually went and lived in India for 3 years. So between the ages of 3 and 6. And then I migrated back when I was 6 years old. And I remember coming and I was like, who are these people that are my parents? I was like, I'd never actually, like, I didn't remember them. And then I also didn't speak English. So when I came back, so before I left, I had spoken English, but when I came back, I didn't speak it at all. And so I remember starting, like, I started first grade when I was 6. And then I remember I couldn't understand a word that anybody said. I was like, the teacher was talking, and I was like, what did she say? What am I supposed to do? And so I think it was kind of, that was my journey. And so my mom is actually an attorney. So after she finished her education, she actually became a programmer. And then she was a programmer for a long time. And then finally, when I was 12, she decided she needed to continue her education, and she actually became a lawyer. So she went to law school at night, and then started practicing. So she started practicing around the time that I had graduated high school. So it was I think I had a very kind of non-traditional background. I always had a working mom. So I always had this expectation that, like, all mothers worked, because that's what my mother did. So I think I had a very kind of different experience than most people.
Wow. Your mom. I should be interviewing your mom too. That's amazing. Gosh. And what an example for you of what's possible, right? It sounds like, the
Yes.
sort of, the rigor that she put into, the commitment that she put into her own growth and development, that has to have been impactful to you in some way, right?
Oh yes, yeah, yeah. I think definitely like the work ethic, like, like her tremendous work ethic, and like, just supporting us. And, I think that was like,
That's amazing.
definitely a big part of my growing up.
That's wonderful. Um, Tell me, in terms of, if we think about your career choices, which you've been, you sort of laid out for us, the movements that you've made, the moves that you've made and where you've gone. Um, how would, what was the biggest fail? My grandmother actually said, poop makes great fertilizer. Forgive me, a little crass, but, sometimes our biggest fails, our biggest face plants, are some of our greatest learnings and our greatest takeaways. And we might not know it at the time, but in hindsight, they are. What was a big fail? What was a face plant for you? And how did that turn into a garden down the road?
One of the things was, joining Lightning eMotors, and then very quickly watching it run out of money. And that was, very challenging, because I think for all of us, like, we had this like deep, deep hope for, we all thought we were making the world a better place. But just realizing, like, how challenging it was, and all of the things that you have to get right, that realizing there's also circumstances beyond your control. Like, in a lot of ways, the ability to fundraise was became almost impossible after the SPAC boom was over and the markets closed. And I think just, kind of just seeing those kinds of issues, I think just sort of really help me realize, like, there's only a certain extent to which you can control all the different things that can go on. And just sort of help me realize, like, okay, what are the kinds of things that I need to do as an attorney to help enable the business team? What are the things that, I can help the company just stay mindful of? and help it move forward.
That sounds like a lot of opportunity for growth in there, right? Yeah, and like you say, the phrase that I always use is control the controllables. We can't control the external market. Many things we can't control, but looking at what we can, it sometimes feels, the only empowering way to move forward. So I know I appreciate that so much. And if you think about, getting to where you are certainly has not been without sacrifice, right? I'm sure not only just a lot of hours, a lot of time, but what were some of the sacrifices that you've made along the way that you might not even have known were a sacrifice?
I think there's a lot of like talk about work-life balance, and I think when you take a C-level role, I think it's almost impossible. It's there are costs, and you don't have infinite time. And I think that's like one of the things which like I don't think I necessarily fully realized before I took like my first public company general counsel position. And so I'd say that's like one thing, like when people ask me like, this is something I want to do, I'm like, well, okay, just think about it. There's a lot of trade-offs you have to make. So I have two daughters. They are 9 and 12. And I can't spend all the time with them. I have missed, many recitals, many performances. Sometimes when I go home at night, my daughter is like, please put the phone down. So she's telling me to put the phone down because, there's something going on. So I often, we have a global company. So we have offices in Korea or Malaysia and or India. And so with the time differences, oftentimes I have to get on the phone at night. And so
I know it
there's
well.
been many times where my daughter's like, please put the phone down. Family life struggles, do exist. And when you're at a bigger company or you're not the DC, things can be easier. And then there are those trade-offs, and, you should just stay mindful of those trade-offs.
Absolutely. And in terms of, you as a leader, when you think about your leadership style and the teams that you've built or managed, um, how have you stayed in, I should say, how do you identify your own blind spots, right? Like we all have them, right?
Mhm.
How do
Yeah.
you identify your blind spots as a leader?
I'm not a super political person. I'm not somebody that like I like to just do my job and do what I'm supposed to do. And then not really think about other things. And I think life doesn't always work that way. And so that was a big learning for me. I think just, understanding that, people are people, and that it's good to just understand, sometimes like businesses also have conflicting interests internally, and just understanding like, that there are different forces at play, and understanding agendas, and all of that. I think was something that I feel is actually a really critical skill. That's something like always to be worked on. And I think especially in my role as a chief legal officer, I spend a lot of time just making sure I'm being as objective as possible, and that I'm not taking everything at face value. So if somebody tells me something, I also am thinking about like what's underneath that. And is there something else that's not being said that I should consider? And then especially now, it's like, well, are there things that somebody's too scared to talk about? And if so, like, am I doing enough to just make sure that they're comfortable, to, speak up? And for me, just understanding, I think also maybe because I was so, like I had focused so much on academics for so long, I was just kind of, and especially as a lawyer, I think like in some ways, like you expect some things to be, just very clear. There's, rule, like, almost like, oh, okay, like if you're an engineer, like, okay, there's a 0 or a 1, right? And understanding the gray, and when is there gray, and how do you deal with the gray?
I would love to know in those situations, are there principles that you use to sort of guide those tough decisions? What are the goalposts that you aim for? What is the framework that you use when you're making tough decisions?
I read about the OODA loop, and it's observe, orient, decide, and act. And I feel like for me, especially in my role as a chief legal officer, I'm not often quick to respond. And that's on purpose. I'd like to just be deliberate, observe what's going on, understand what the issues are, orient myself, decide and then act. And often the decisions, especially in my role, they're not my decisions. They're decisions I make in conjunction with the team, and just making sure that the team feels all comfortable. This is the risk we want to take, and this is what we want to do, and having a debate about it. I think that's also really important.
I think that's wonderful because it sounds like you're slow to respond intentionally, and yet you surround yourself with a team that you can trust, so that you're getting more than one input, right? I think that's great. I would love to know, how do you balance, Arthi, risk and risk for your company, versus big strategic thinking, like making big and bold moves, right? You're right at that cross section, right?
At any company, I actually think that, ultimately you're making a series of risk decisions constantly. And I think that the more successful the company is, the more that they've thought through all of the risks. Part of good business planning is, thinking long term, reviewing risks, and then just making measured decisions.
I think that's a great framework, and I think it makes a ton of sense. And speaking of risk, in terms of how you managed or navigated a very difficult situation, is there another example that you could give where you were really put to the test, and you had to sort of dig deep in terms of like, ooh, what are we going to do in this one? And again, how specific you choose to be anecdotally, I'll leave up to you, but I'd just be curious if there's a real life example.
So I remember, actually, I'd worked with our CEO before, our CEO at Enovix, before at a previous company. And I remember a time when we were, we had 30 billion in sales at Micron. So we have a whole series of customers. We had customers all over the maps. Some of them were small companies, some of them were large companies. And then we had one company in particular that was just, very impossible, just the demands that they had, we couldn't meet, the pricing they had, we couldn't meet. And so I remember, I talked to the CEO about it. He was GM at the time. And then we were like, okay, well, what do we do with this customer? And then I was like, well, what happens if you just, what happens if you just reallocate supplies? So take their supply, give it somewhere else, and then see what happens. Because Micron has a little bit of leverage. Can we just use that leverage? The CEO, he did it, which I didn't think he would do, because I was like, it's a crazy move. It's a crazy move.
Genius, right?
It's always very difficult,
Awesome.
challenging your customer like that, because you don't know what'll happen, right? You don't know what the ramifications are. To his credit, I cannot believe he did this, but he did it. He reallocated supply. He challenged his customer, and then after that, things became much easier. It was just so much easier. The expectations, the demands, were so much more reasonable. And he had the incredible courage to do that, and then to take that risk, and then to execute on it. To supplant all of those sales with other customers. That was an enormous undertaking. And I was like, God, what was I thinking when I said that? But it actually ended up working out.
It was your idea, just calling that out. It was your idea. So yes, it takes courage to execute, but you got to give yourself a few stripes on your shoulder for the fact that it was your idea.
It was a crazy idea, but he did it. But I was like, sometimes just going with it, sometimes just going with your gut can help. not always being so,
Absolutely.
there's always a balance. Sometimes you want to observe and not say anything, and then sometimes it's just time to act.
Totally. Well, and it sounds like you've got a really good sense of what that is, right? When to sit back, observe, listen, and then move forward with intention versus there's times when you get that hit as a leader, and you're like, this would be the smart move, right? And I think that really is the artistry, I think, that can characterize the C-suite. It's that what do we do with limited information when time is of the essence? How do we call on that wisdom that's crystallized over time? All of the decisions you've made that were tough, challenging, that got you to the point. It's those moments that we really have to honor, right? That's why you're in the role you're in, and that's how it all kind of comes together. That is that artistry. Um, yeah, and I'd love to get your thoughts on technology and the impact that technology is having on what you do every day, right?
For me, I've always worked at different technology companies after I moved in-house. And so I think technology, just like it is the future. I think it underpins everything that we do. And I think like there's kind of good things and bad things about technology. I mean, the good things are that like it makes life easier in so many ways. And it really just helps, can just help reshape the universe. And so like part of the reason why I decided to work at Enovix actually was because we're building a breakthrough battery. So if you look at battery technology today, like we have, like the technology has been in existence for 30 years. And, 3 scientists actually won the Nobel Prize in the early 1990s for creating what is today the graphite battery. And then since then, there's been no innovation. So Enovix will be one of the first companies to actually come out to the market with the silicon battery, which is, very different.
Very,
And
very
so
cool.
the exciting thing about it is we're really hoping that, it'll be game changing for, for the world, because you can use your phone for longer. You can use your laptop for longer. My laptop, lasts for like an hour and a half without without having, without
Same.
plugging it in.
Absolutely. Very cool. And is there a trend in your industry or something that's going on that you're really excited about, just overall, and as it relates to your industry?
The promise of silicon has been there for some time. There's been a lot of companies that have been trying to work on silicon-based batteries. So silicon, like part of the reason why the company was founded was really to just find a more readily available material that you can use to make a battery. And so to date, nobody has come out to the market with a silicon battery. That's because battery technology is incredibly complicated. It's very difficult to make a battery. Even make a graphite battery is very difficult, even though there's lots of known ways of doing it. The promise of silicon is that it's a more wider, readily available material that can be used. It's also less expensive. And then Enovix is actually the only company that's been sampling silicon batteries to date.
Very exciting. And I love that update. And gosh, timely, and yeah, and what a positive impact. And speaking of impact, pivoting a little bit to when you think about, and I know you've got a lot of runway left in terms of your career here, but when you think about, whether it's, 15, 20, however many years into the future, when you think of yourself looking back on your career, is there an impact or a legacy that you hope to leave? Is there a difference that you hope to make, or that all of your hard hours of work and effort will contribute to?
When we started Hospital for Hope, so the Hospital for Hope was started by myself, and then we have 4 other Stanford undergrad students. We were all at Stanford together, all at different times. And so I graduated in 2000, and then every one of us is like 1 year behind. So our last one, she graduated in 2006, and I didn't even know her because we didn't overlap. But we all founded this organization called Hospital for Hope because we had done a service learning project when we were in undergrad, and we had all gone to India. and worked with this nonprofit. And it was a really life-changing experience for all of us, because I think we all saw like firsthand what poverty was, or is, what poverty is, and the kind of just all these different forces that restrict society in certain ways. Like we saw, poverty cycles where there were just generations of sometimes you'd see 2, 3 generations in a slum in India, and it was very, very painful to see sometimes, because you'd see children that didn't have enough food, or children that didn't have access to healthcare. And so I think for us, when we all graduated and we kind of all felt we were in an economically comfortable enough position, we were like, we need to find a way to give back. And so that was a really, 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 really that was something that was very important for all of us. And I think it was very different in some ways from kind of the way that all of us had grown up. I think all of us had kind of grown up thinking that you have to have one job or one career or one pathway. And I think for us, we were like, no, we also want to do nonprofit work. We also want to contribute to society, even if it's not necessarily directly through your workplace, or it's not achievable directly through your workplace. Like you have to live, you have to, support your family, and things like that. And so we wanted to create a pathway where people could also volunteer in their spare time, or, find causes that were meaningful for them, and, and contribute. We started Hospital for Hope really to just give back to the community in India that had taught us so much. So the nonprofit that we actually serve is a nonprofit that most of us had done our service learning project with, which is really nice because, we've been basically in some way, shape, or form working with that nonprofit for over 30 years now.
I think from an impact perspective, you've been on the board, I think 9 years, as I recall. That's incredibly impactful. And I think if, that social work and giving back in that way is something that, you'll look back on and be proud of. I mean, that's what it's about, right? I guess, I'll follow it with kind of a loaded question. But Arthi, do you feel you're successful? Are you successful? And if so, how do you measure it?
I think I've been very fortunate. I've gotten a lot of support from mentors, different sponsors along the way. And I couldn't have become a chief legal officer unless I'd had that support. And I think like what's really important for me is just making sure that we, just like me as a person, that I'm doing what I can to just, stay mindful of differences in societies, and encouraging people from different backgrounds into roles that maybe they didn't have, or opportunities they wouldn't have had before. And so that's something like I really try to stay mindful of, like when I'm hiring, or when I'm so I always think about who's the best person for the job, no doubt. I always want really good people on my team. And I always want to work with the best people. But at the same time, I think it's very important to give opportunities as well.
I think as a leader, that can define us, right? So many of the folks that I know that are honored enough to and have worked really hard to get where they are in their career have left a legacy behind them of others that they've mentored and that have now gone on to do great things, right? So I think that's another successful measurement or metric is, well, how many folks did I kind of bring up along with me, right? So I think
Yes.
the fact that you have awareness of that and that you cultivate that amongst the people that you hire and how you hire, that's a huge impact and a legacy right there, is looking back on all those folks and being invested in their success and their impact ultimately. So I think that's wonderful. What impact do you still have yet to make? What's left? What's your next hill that you're going to climb?
One of the things that I had been thinking about was becoming a board member. I feel like I can bring a lot of value, based on all of the things that I've seen, over the years, just all the acquisitions. I've helped 2 companies now that have gone through, different types of fundraisings, including public offerings. And so that's one of the things that I am thinking about.
That's wonderful. Well, and obviously you've got lots more good things to come, I'm sure. I want to make sure if there's any last shares or insights or things, maybe something I didn't ask you that I should have asked you, or is there anything um that you would like to share before we close out?
Be the change you wish to see in the world. And I think there's just a number of components to that kind of phrase, and that I really take to heart. And I think one of it is just, you know, feeling personal responsibility. Change begins with each person. Leading by example. So just demonstrating the behavior you want to see in others, and then having the inner transformation. So external change starts first with internal change. And I feel like this phrase just, it means a lot to me because I was like, I think it applies in daily life. I think it applies to, companies. I think it applies to nonprofits. And I feel like it in some ways underpins some of the things that I've done. For us, when we started Hospital for Hope, we all felt so conflicted after we graduated because so many of us just really wanted to go into public service. And then, but some of us just had to be very practical and like, pay back student loans and things like that. And so for us, most of us chose that, we chose this pathway where, we became professionals and we, started working at, different companies. And we couldn't be service professionals at the same time.
I think there's such an opportunity for us as corporate citizens to be artists in business suits or philanthropists in business suits, right? Or, whatever that is, right? I think, using our corporate citizenship as a platform to drive change, to drive awareness, right? I think it's a wonderful combination. And clearly you're doing it really well. And I'm excited to hear the continued transformation, to use your word and one of my favorite words, with what happens with Hospital for Hope with India. And I just so appreciate your time and your insights and your wisdom of your experience. Thus far, it's been great to share some time together. And if people wanted to find out more about Hospital for Hope in India, what can you give a little tagline there? Or
hospitalforhope.com. And then
okay,
folks can go there and then learn more about the nonprofit
and give lots of
and
money,
donate.
right?
Yeah.
I love that part.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So it's amazing what little, like, so it turns out that the actual cost to run a hospital in India is like $30,000. Part of what we've done is we donate annually. We donate so that the patients can come in and receive healthcare. But we're also building like a trust for the hospital so that even after we're all gone, the hospital can continue and continue to help the community that we support in India. It's actually one of the regions that we support is like one of the poorest in India, so the literacy rates are very low. The average wage is like something like $30 a month, and so every contribution is actually incredibly meaningful for the community.
I love that, and I love what you're doing, and so grateful to have your time today, and really appreciate you spending the time together. Thank you for joining, Arthi, and best of luck to you and all of your endeavors. Thanks for being here.